and I'm not a Trump supporter at all. But there's some issues that I saw with the Roger Stone case and some perceptiveness of the Michael Flynn case. Now, the perceptiveness of the Michael Flynn case is, I was very suspicious of the testimony that I was hearing about the supposed Russian collusion that was hacking the internet, right? Do I think the internet was hacked and all that, this and there? I think everybody got hacked in their heads, let alone on the internet, of course. But I don't think Russia did it. Nonetheless, as I saw this testimony going on, someone was highlighted to me to keep an eye on her. And it was the exiting Department of Justice Chief Susan Yates. Now, I'm assuming, okay, well, I'll put that in my back pocket for now, that we're going to catch her lying or something like that. Because it was very suspicious what she was saying. And this was like all this stuff had gone down just before she was basically leaving her job. And I'm not talking about the Russian collusion. I'm talking about the Michael Flynn incident. And so recently I decided, I better go back and look at that. I don't want to watch Congress testimony, but, something told me to go back and take a look at it. And it wasn't anything that she did wrong. In fact, it's quite astonishing. You can see right there where the demarcation line started with the lies. Because what happens is this. Now, Michael Flynn, remember, he was basically charged with lying to the FBI. Now, I had heard, right when this happens, you really got to catch the news because they'll tuck it away afterwards. What was the scenario here? I don't understand. How did he lie to the FBI? He's not arrested yet, but they want to talk to him, blah, blah, blah. Well, from what I understand, the FBI came by on a casual visit or something to that effect. They didn't come by to investigate him, or they did, but they didn't read him any rights. He didn't have any legal counsel. He just was talking to the FBI. Now, keep in mind, he's the lead guy for the NSA. So he's going to have communications with other people, including people from Russia or whatever country. So when they say he talked to Russia, don't get it twisted because it's his fucking job. Okay? But what Susan Yates says is quite astonishing. They got a hold of some incidental surveillance information. Now, what does that mean? It means that they had someone under surveillance and they got some information that isn't supposed to be legally gathered, but it's incidental. So they can't really use it in a way, but they can use it in a way because it wasn't what they were intending to get. One of those deals. And what she says is really interesting. See, she worked under the Obama administration. And she had seen that Trump and Vice President Pence were giving false statements to the press that were in the New York Post and all these other areas. And she was so astonished that she decided she had to go tell the White House about this. Why? Well, that's interesting because the first response that Don McGahn, the guy in the White House at the time with Trump, said was, "What business is it of the DOJ if one White House representative lies to another?" They were assuming, or she was assuming, because she had information otherwise, that he was being basically compromised, as she put it, because he had lied to the vice president and to Trump. That's what she said. But where did she get that idea? Because they knew they had the conversation or whatever of what really went down with Russia or whatever Michael Flynn was talking about. They had that as the incidental information. She's assuming because they were lying that Michael Flynn must have lied to them. Why? Because that's their database. Michael Flynn, the lead guy of the NSA, has been the only source of their information. So Michael Flynn probably told them the truth. Then they started lying. Now, they said, well, can we see this incidental information? She said, yes. What happened after that? Well, that was her last day at the office, and she was gone. And if I recall correctly, as Will Ferrell would say, that's right when they started lying hardcore. So Michael Flynn didn't lie. Because if you think about the nature of what she's saying, it makes no sense. Now, they said that he lied to the FBI. Now, keep in mind, I've been through that, where, he didn't know, if you say any lie to an FBI agent, at any time, you don't have to be under investigation. That's against the law. Did you know that? No, it doesn't matter if they're on the clock. They could have come by and visited him for drinks on Christmas Eve. He still can't lie to the FBI. But there's even some confusion about that. Now, as soon as I say that, people say, "Oh, you're supporting Trump." No, Michael Flynn actually was around before that, and Trump hired him right away anyway. So how I don't understand where you're saying that he's a friend of Trump's. Everyone that gets fired isn't necessarily a friend of Trump's. In fact, now it's Trump's enemy. But my point is this: is that's where you got to do it, man. You got to score for the enemy. And I'm telling you, Michael Flynn was one of those cases. But sure enough, on the side yesterday, they dismissed all the charges on him. So here's one cat down, because I'm telling you, there was something suspicious with that. But if you look at her testimony on that, and you see why did she go and tell the president about this?
The contents of which I obviously cannot go through today because it's classified. But we took them through in a fair amount of detail of the underlying conduct, what General Flynn had done, and then we walked through the various press accounts and how it had been falsely reported. We also told the White House counsel that General Flynn had been interviewed by the FBI on February 24th. Mr. McGahn asked me how he did, and I declined to give him an answer to that. And we then walked through with Mr. McGahn essentially why we were telling them about this. And the first thing we did was to explain to Mr. McGahn that the underlying conduct that General Flynn had engaged in was problematic in and of itself. Secondly, we told him we felt like the vice president and others were entitled to know that the information that they were conveying to the American people wasn't true.
Right there.
And we wanted to make it really clear right out of the gate that we were not accusing Vice President Pence of knowingly providing false information to the American people. And in fact, Mr. McGahn responded back to me to let me know that anything that General Flynn would have said would have been based, anything that Vice President Pence would have said would have been based on what General Flynn had told him.
Right.
We told him the third reason is because we were concerned that the American people had misled about the underlying conduct and what General Flynn had done. And additionally, that we weren't the only ones that knew all of this, that the Russians also knew about what General Flynn had done. And the Russians also knew that General Flynn had misled the vice president and others. Because in the media accounts, it was clear from the vice president and others that they were repeating what General Flynn had told them.
Not necessarily.
And that this was a problem because not only did we believe that the Russians knew this, but that they likely had proof of this information. And that created a compromise situation, a situation where the national security advisor essentially could be blackmailed by the Russians. Finally, we told them that we were giving them all of this information so that they could take action, the action that they deemed appropriate. I remember that Mr. McGahn asked me whether or not General Flynn should be fired. And I told him that that really wasn't our call, that was up to them, but that we were giving them this information so that they could take action. And that was the first meeting.
Thank you, and I'll go to Senator White. One very quick question. Are either one of you aware of incidental collection by our intelligence community of any presidential candidate, staff, or campaign during the 2016 election cycle? Was there any incidental collection where our intelligence community collects information involving a presidential candidate on either side of the aisle during 2015 or 2016?
No, not to my knowledge.
I believe Director Comey was also asked this question and declined to answer it. So I need to follow the same lines that DOJ has drawn. Again, you should not draw from that my answer is yes, but rather that the answer would require me to reveal classified information.
Thank you. Senator White.
My response is all with the context of foreign intelligence, not the domestic consideration.
Exactly.
Following the Comey line, the director testified a few days ago in the full committee that the FBI had interviewed Mr. Flynn a day before or 2 days before your meeting at the White House. And you just testified that you had told the White House counsel that the FBI had interviewed Flynn and McGahn had asked, how'd he do?
Right.
Right.
Did you have the 302 with you when you were in the White House? Did you show it to White House counsel? And had you seen it at the time you went up to the White House?
No. The FBI had conducted the interview on the 24th. We got a readout from the FBI on the 25th, a detailed readout specifically from the agents that had conducted the interview. But we didn't want to wait for the 302 because we felt that it was important to get this information to the White House as quickly as possible. So we had folks from the National Security Division who spent a lot of time with the agents, not only finding out exactly how the interview went, but how this impacted their investigation.
So did you take that summary with you do you have any document with you that described the FBI interview of General Flynn?
At the time that I was there, I had notes that described that interview, as well as the individual that was with me, the senior career official from the National Security Division, had been part of all of those discussions with the FBI.
Did you discuss criminal prosecution of Mr. Flynn, General Flynn?
My recollection is that did not really come up much in the first meeting. It did come up in the second meeting when Mr. McGann called me back the next morning and asked the morning after, this is the morning of the 27th now, and asked me if I could come back to his office. And so I went back with the NSD official, and there were essentially 4 topics that he wanted to discuss there. And one of those topics was precisely that. He asked about the applicability of certain statutes, certain criminal statutes, and more specifically about
the second meeting at the White House counsel's office. In his office again?
In his office again.
With the same 2 individuals?
Exactly.
On the following day?
Right.
And you went back pursuant to a phone call request, or was...
Yes, the morning of the 27th, after our meeting had occurred on the afternoon of the 26th, the morning of the 27th, Mr. McGann called me and asked if I could come back to the White House to discuss this further. And we set up a time, and I went over there that afternoon, bringing again the same career official with me from National Security Division who was overseeing this investigation. He had the same associate from the White House counsel's office, and we talked through 4 to 5 more issues.
You could perhaps have waited until you actually had seen the agents 302 from the interview of General Flynn. Why go ahead of that? Why not wait?
Right.
Well, because this was a matter of some urgency.
Describe.
In making the determination about notification here, we had to balance a variety of interest. For the reasons that I just described a few minutes ago, we felt like it was critical that we get this information to the White House, in part because the vice president was unknowingly making false statements to the public,
She doesn't know that.
and because we believed that General Flynn was compromised with respect to the Russians. We were balancing this, though, against the FBI's investigation, as you would always do, and take into account the investigating agency's desires and concerns about how a notification might impact that ongoing investigation. But once General Flynn was interviewed, there was no longer a concern about an impact on an investigation.
Do you know where that interview took place, or under what circumstances?
I believe it took place at the White House.
The Flynn interview?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if Flynn was represented by counsel at the time?
I don't believe he was.
Okay. And the scenario that you were concerned about was that you were seeing all these statements coming from the White House that were inconsistent with what you knew.
Right.
You presumed that the White House was being truthful, which meant that Flynn was misleading them.
Right.
Which meant that he was vulnerable to manipulation by the Russians, who, knowing what had actually taken place, could call up the national security advisor to the president and say, you got to do this for us, or we're going to out you with all your folks and your career is done.
That's right, because one of the questions that Mr. McGann asked me when I went back over the second day was essentially, why does it matter to DOJ if one White House official lies to another White House official?
Right.
And so we explained to him it was a whole lot more than that, and went back over the same concerns that we had raised with them the prior day, that the concern first about the underlying conduct itself, that he had lied to the vice president and others, the American public had been misled. And then importantly,
by who?
That every time this lie was repeated, and the misrepresentations were getting more and more specific as they were coming out, every time that happened, it increased the compromise. And now, to state the obvious, you don't want your national security advisor compromised with the Russians.
Were there any takeaways from the first meeting or action items that you left with?
Well, there was an action item in the second meeting because we talked about several issues, but
to get the order right, you said earlier that there were 2 meetings and a phone call.
Right.
Was the phone call that set up the second meeting, or was there a third?
There was a third substantive phone call. There was a
go ahead
phone
about
call.
The second.
Sorry about that. One of the issues that Mr. McGann raised with me in this second meeting, that again was on the 27th, the day after the first meeting, was his concern, because we had told him before that we were giving him this information so that they could take action. And he said that they were concerned that taking action might interfere with the FBI investigation. And we told him, both the senior career official and I, that he should not be concerned with it, that General Flynn had been interviewed, that their action would not interfere with any investigation. And in fact, I remember specifically saying, it wouldn't really be fair of us to tell you this and then expect you to sit on your hands.
Was the interview of General Flynn accelerated once you became aware of this information and felt you needed to get his statement quickly?
Well, we had wanted to tell the White House as quickly as possible, and we're working with the FBI in the course of the investigation, but certainly we did as the
first thing you
misrepresentations.
know is that you have information that one thing was said and the White House is saying something different.
Right. That's the key.
And you know that information, irrespective of who is involved, needs to get up to the White House quickly.
Right.
And so at that point, the decision was made to do the interview so that was locked down before you went up to White House counsel?
Right, so that would not have a negative impact on the FBI investigation at that point. And there was a request made by Mr. McGahn in the second meeting as to whether or not they would be able to look at the underlying evidence that we had described for him of General Flynn's conduct.
Right here.
And we told them that we were inclined to allow them to look at that underlying evidence, that we wanted to go back to DOJ and be able to make the logistical arrangements for that. This second meeting on the 27th occurred late in the afternoon. This is Friday, the 27th. So we told them that we would work with the FBI over the weekend on this issue and get back with them on Monday morning. And I called him first thing Monday morning to let him know that we would allow them to come over and to review the underlying evidence.
Okay, watch this.
And was that the phone call or is there a separate phone call?
There was the phone call initially to let him know I needed to come see him.
Yeah.
2 meetings, and then a phone call at the end to let him know
that the material
was available. He had to call me back. He was not available then, and I did not hear back from him until that afternoon of Monday the 30th.
And that was the end of this episode. Nobody came over to look at the material.
I don't know what happened after that because that was my last day with DOJ.
Got it.
Wow.
Okay.
That was her last day. So just like he said, now here's the interesting thing. What I think she's telling the truth. She thinks Michael Flynn lied to the president. Why? Because they lied in the paper, and no president would lie like that. She was working under the Obama administration, so this should be regular stuff, right, guys? I mean, I'm just saying, it's incidental evidence. So I guess presidents really don't lie to the public, because she heard a lie from Trump and Pence and assumed, well, the NSA guy must have lied to you then, because you would never lie to the people. And even Trump supporters say, we don't care if he lies. He's got to do what he's got to do with the job. Yeah, but she worked under the Obama administration. This is new to her. She was shocked. So I guess that's another apology. But that was her last day. Why did she rush to get that to him? Very odd. See, now what happened today is this.
For a House hearing into political influence at the Justice Department, a U.S. appeals court on Wednesday directed a federal judge to drop a criminal case against President Donald Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, for lying to the FBI.
I think that General Flynn is a wonderful man, and it was a disgrace what happened to General Flynn.
President Trump has routinely defended Flynn and called for leniency. Last month, Attorney General William Barr, in an extraordinary move, ordered the Justice Department to dismiss its case against Flynn, despite the fact that Flynn pleaded guilty twice to lying to the FBI about his conversations with Russia's then ambassador Sergei Kislyak. In a 2-1 decision, a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit ruled to prevent U.S. District Judge Emmett Sullivan from exercising his discretion on whether to grant the department's motion to clear Flynn. The ruling blocked Sullivan from hearing arguments at a July 16th hearing from a retired judge whom he appointed as a friend of the court to argue against dropping the case. Judge Naomi Rao, who was appointed by Trump, wrote that the district court's actions would, quote, result in specific harms to the exercise of the executive branch's exclusive prosecutorial power. Judge Robert Wilkins, an Obama administration appointee, dissented, He said the Justice Department's flip-flop on the case raised questions that merited further scrutiny by the district court. Wednesday's ruling is likely to anger Democrats who have accused Barr of improperly meddling in criminal cases to help benefit Trump's friends and political allies.